Well, I had what I thought was a pretty good talk prepared, but there's only one problem. The notes are in my hotel room, I just discovered. So I'll have to wing it, and that means I can't take responsibility for quotes and exact references, but if you want them, I can provide them from memory, as is what I'll be talking about. There are... the world is, of course, always changing. There are, however, some quite significant continuities. It's worth paying attention to them. One is a principle that was expressed a couple of hundred years ago by a well-known figure named Adam Smith, who talked about governance and how it works. He pointed out that the people who own the society, those he called the masters of mankind, will also be the ones who set policy, and they will pursue what he called their vile maxim, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. If that sounds familiar, it is. He was, of course, particularly interested in England, and in England he said the masters of mankind are the merchants and manufacturers, and they devise policy. They're the principal architects of policy, and they ensure that their own interests are very well served, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England. But particularly what concerned him properly was the victims of their savage injustice elsewhere. India was his prime concern. There are modern, sophisticated versions of Smith's thesis adapted to our own society. The best one I know is by a very good, very fine political economist, Thomas Ferguson. It's what he calls his investment theory of politics. It interprets elections as occasions on which the groups of investors coalesce to invest to control the state. And as he shows over the past century, that's quite a good predictor of what policy is going to be, just looking at the coalitions of investors who became the principal architects of policy. Today it's not merchants and manufacturers, it's multinational corporations and financial institutions, but the principles remain about the same. In fact, we saw a good example of it in the last election, 2008. Obama's victory in 2008 was primarily due to a big flow of capital that poured in, especially toward the end, from financial institutions who preferred him to McCain, and that carried him over the edge. And of course, they expected to be rewarded, and they were immediately. The country was in the midst of a big financial crisis, so the main task was to deal with it. Obama picked an economic team to deal with the crisis. The team was selected almost entirely from the people who were responsible for the crisis. That excluded quite prestigious figures, Nobel laureates and others who had been very critical of what they'd done. And not particularly surprisingly, they produced a policy which rewarded those who were responsible for the crisis, often with criminal acts, and left everyone else in the dust. Actually, there was an interesting review of this a couple of days ago, which maybe you saw, by Neil Barofsky, who was the special investigator for the bailout. And he points out that the legislation behind the bailout was actually a compromise. The banks who were responsible for the crisis would be bailed out by the taxpayer, of course in violation of capitalist principles, but that doesn't bother anyone. But the victims, the people who were their victims, would get some kind of compensation. He pointed out, now it's a couple of years later, we can see what happens. Half the compromise was carried out. The implementation responded to the people who have a voice. the masters of mankind, and they were billed out royally. They're now the biggest ones are richer and bigger than before, poised to set off the next crisis, which is almost inevitable. Meanwhile, the other half of the bargain was eliminated. Foreclosures continue to mount. They're going even higher. On those notes back in my hotel room, I have some of the numbers, but they're pretty telling. And that's the way democratic politics works in a society with high concentration of wealth and power. This concentration is not a law of nature. It's not due to economic principles or history or whatever. It's due to decisions, specific decisions. The country's always, of course, been unequal, but as I'm sure all of you know, it's now reached a level of inequality that's breaking all records. And that's misleading, because the actual primary cause of the inequality is in such a small sector of the population that it isn't even picked up by census figures. So you have to do more careful economic analysis to figure out what it is. It's basically the top 1/10 of 1% of the population, which has become spectacularly wealthy in recent years. The rest is bad enough, but that's what's tilting the balance kind of off the scale. And as in accord with Smith's maxim, they are the greater their economic power, the greater their political power, and they use it to accelerate the vicious cycle that has been set off. It was set off in its current form back in the early 1970s. That's the major change in world affairs since the Second World War. There was an economic system, international economic system, established by the victors in the war, the United States and Britain, John Maynard Keynes for Britain, Harry Dexter White for the United States, so-called Bretton Woods system, which laid the basis for several decades of unparalleled growth over a long period. Economists sometimes call it the golden age of state capital. They call it capitalism, state capitalism, big state component in it. No financial crises. New Deal, regulatory apparatus was still in place. The growth period was also egalitarian. The lowest quintile did about as well as the highest quintile. And that continued up until the 70s, the early 1970s. There was a significant shift. That compact, the Bretton Woods system, was based on regulation of finance, regulation of capital. So currencies were set pretty well fixed, a small band. Hence no speculation on currencies. Governments had the right to control capital flows, which they did. All of that was dismantled in the early 1970s and had a very big effect. One over the world. One in the United States, the effect was, and in fact elsewhere, a very sharp increase in in the growth of financial institutions. Back at that time, they were essentially doing what they're supposed to do in a state capitalist economy. Like a bank is supposed to take unused capital, like your bank account, and transmit it to some productive purpose. And pretty much that's what banks were doing. Now it's totally different. Starting in the early 70s, they moved towards more and more exotic financial manipulations, which have nothing to do with the productive economy, and in fact probably harm it, but do make plenty of money. That withdraws capital from productive purposes. But it reached such a point that right before the last crash, financial institutions literally had about 40% of corporate profits. By now, after the crash, now they're picking up again, and pretty soon it'll be the same or more. As I say, they have no known social function other than making money for people who play around with investments and short-term capital flows and so on. Meanwhile, and that set off this vicious cycle, increasing concentration of capital. The top 0.1% means CEOs, hedge fund managers, people like that. With it, concentration of political power. That concentration of political power is then used to escalate the cycle by all sorts of legislative means. For example, tax policy. Tax policy is increasingly designed to benefit the super rich and harm everyone else. That's been going on for years, has no economic purpose, but it does serve the interests of the masters of mankind. Sometimes it's done pretty subtly sometimes, so you don't notice it. So the Bush tax cuts, which are now heavily burdening the economy, were designed so that people wouldn't notice what's happening. So the first year, you may recall, the first year of the tax cuts, everybody got a small rebate, a couple $100 in the mail, so you feel good about it. And it wasn't too unbalanced the first year, somewhat, but not too much. But it was designed so that by the end, after the end of the 10-year period, over half went to the top 1% of the population. But by then, it's kind of hard to figure out, so people just remember that first year. It's called the sunset policy. You design policy so that first it won't be noticeable, but by the time the sun sets, it'll do the right thing, go into the pockets of the very rich. And those same policies continue to be pursued in other domains. Actually, we've just seen it in the lame duck session of Congress that, since last November. Obama was greatly praised for his statesmanship and bipartisanship and making important legislation go through, no bickering in Congress, and that's true. The main legislative achievement was to cut taxes for the super rich, and I mean super rich, like I'm pretty well off, but I was below the cutoff point. It's the very rich, make sure that they get a big tax cut. Meanwhile, everybody's pounding the table about the need to reduce the deficit. It was a pretty tricky PR campaign to carry that off, but it was done. At the same time, with less notice, there was a tax increase for federal workers. Now, it wasn't called a tax increase because that doesn't sound nice. It was called a freeze on pay, but it takes about 30 seconds for you to figure out that a freeze on pay for public sector workers is a tax increase for the public sector workers. And if it extends over a couple of years, it's a significant tax increase because of the effect of inflation, population growth, and so on. So a significant tax increase for public sector workers, big tax decrease for the super wealthy, huge impact on the deficit, trillions of dollars, and it was somehow carried off. Actually, there was another tricky measure that was introduced. There was a payroll decrease for Social Security. So, people who pay Social Security got a slight rebate. That's a good idea in itself. What's needed today is the deficit is a secondary problem. What's needed is a stimulus of demand to increase growth. You're not supposed to talk about that. That's outside the spectrum, but pretty obviously true. So a payroll decrease in Social Security makes good sense, but it's a Trojan horse. Take a look at the way it was designed. It was designed to run out just before the 2012 election. Both parties understand that with the 2012 election coming on, nobody's going to call for a tax increase. Okay, that's poison. So therefore it's permanent. Permanent decline in funding for Social Security means that it really will have a problem. Now it has no problem. That's all fakery. That's very good shape for decades to come and can be tweaked to go on forever. But if it is defunded, it'll have a problem. Now, there's a standard way of privatizing something. Like when Margaret Thatcher wanted to privatize the British railroads, the technique was defund them. And then when they don't work, people get angry. They say, let's do something. So you hand it over to private enterprise, which totally ruins them, and then the state has to come back in, big cost, and try to reconstruct it somehow. It's known as privatization. And that's exactly what's happening with Social Security. It's in good shape now. When you read in the newspapers, as you do, that the big problem of the deficit is entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Social Security is a zero problem. For one thing, it doesn't add anything to the deficit because people pay for it. And for another thing, it's in pretty good shape. Certainly, the last of the famous baby boomers will be gone before there's any problem in it. That's why there's a big payroll tax increase 30 years ago to ensure that. But if it's defunded, it'll be a problem. Then there'll be pressure to privatize it. That's a huge bonanza for the financial institutions. It'll put trillions of dollars into their hands, which they can then use to make a ton of money with risky investments, which are therefore very profitable. And when it tanks, as it will, when the economy tanks, there's a technique. You pick up your copies of Milton Friedman and Hayek and Ayn Rand, and you run to the nanny state that you've nurtured, and you make sure that they bail you out. That's really existing capitalism. And it means that the scam can go on. The name for it is too big to fail. And as one commentator put it, also too big to jail, because a lot of this is purely criminal. Borofsky points out that credit agencies are now taking into account and assigning rankings on the assumption that the system's going to crash and that the taxpayer will come in and bail them out. That's what we call capitalism. Market principles for the poor, but not for me, please. That's traditional. I'll come back to it in a minute. But that's what's being done with Social Security. It's also being done with public education. It's being defunded, so it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, people get angry. And then they want to do something about it, and then the propaganda starts pouring in about teachers with their huge pensions and so on and so forth. And so people get angry at teachers, not at Goldman Sachs, which just announced quietly $17.5 billion of compensation for the executives who created the crisis, special $12.5 million bonus for the CEO, and tripling of his base salary. You don't get angry at them. What you do is get angry at the teachers, the firefighters, and all these people who are milking us and so on. A standard technique of population control. And if you defund the system and people want to privatize it, it'll sooner or later get privatized because it doesn't work very well. It'll be worse, but it's fine for the rich. They'll be taken care of. They don't care much if you have public education. Actually, you might ask, why is there such an intense effort, and it's really fanatic if you look at it, to destroy Social Security and public education? They work pretty well. Social Security has like a tiny fraction of the administrative costs of privatized systems. Basically none. All the money comes right back to the people who paid the taxes. And it's of no value to rich people, like Pete Peterson, the multi-billionaire who's pressing the campaign. He points out constantly, look, I don't care about it, which is quite true. He wouldn't notice it. It's not even a rounding error. But a lot of people live on it, especially after they've lost all their assets. There's just been a loss of $8 trillion of capital that people mistakenly put into housing. The economists and the Federal Reserve were, for ideological reasons, I'll come back to it, didn't notice that there's a huge housing bubble had nothing to do with any economic fundamentals. It was completely dissociated from from rents, which it should be connected to. And it was totally off the chart of 100 years of records of how housing pretty much correlated with economic growth. Here it shot up. It wasn't noticed because of a religious doctrine. That's a religious doctrine called the efficient market hypothesis. That's what Joseph Stiglitz, 15 years ago, Nobel laureate, called the religion that markets know best. And if you're a firm believer in the religion, it'll take care of itself. So you don't have to notice it. And when it crashes, you say, I'm sorry, folks, but now it's up to the taxpayer to bail you out, government insurance policy, and the game goes on. It gets worse next time. In the one of the parts of the vicious cycle that's underway is the change in other legislation. So starting from the 70s, primarily the Reagan years and on, it goes right through Clinton, and of course with Bush, the regulatory apparatus was dismantled. And the barrier, New Deal barrier between commercial and investment banks was broken. That's when the financial crises began. There weren't any in the 50s and the 60s when the New Deal system was in place. But they started under Reagan. Reagan left office with the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, savings and loan. The country was a little less in the grip of this fanaticism then, so there were many convictions, felony convictions for those criminal acts, I think about 1,000. And that, of course, brought up lots of information, but not this time. This time, the guys who carry out the crimes do it with impunity. They're too big to fail, and they're too big to jail, so you don't investigate them. Again, this is all policy. There were other policy decisions that aren't too visible, like changing the rules on corporate governance, which essentially permit CEOs to pick the boards that set their salaries, or to give them stock options or something else that isn't noticeable. Well, all of these things mount up. They're designed to extend the vicious cycle. It's exactly what they do. And we now have a situation. There's something else that's happening too. Several things. I might as well add those. Meanwhile, in relation to this, to the financialization of the economy, there's the rate of profit in manufacturing was in fact declining. So you can make more money by financial manipulations than by producing. And it became increasingly easy to set to offshore production. That's what's called neoliberalism. What it is it's sometimes called free trade. It has nothing whatsoever to do with free trade. It's a system which is highly protectionist for the powerful. So huge grants for, you look at the World Trade Organization rules, guarantees for monopoly pricing rights for publicly funded institutions like pharmaceutical institutions, protection for professionals, no competition for them. But you set working people in competition with one another all over the world. There's obvious effects. It means that worldwide, in fact, there's a decrease in the share of income by working people. It's strikingly true in the United States. During the period of this vast increase in wealth for a tiny sector, wages, real incomes for the majority of the population have stagnated. People get by with higher working hours, in fact, by now higher than Europe and even Japan, debt, which can't go on forever, and asset inflation. That is the hope that your investment in things like your home will carry you over, except that that's all paper money. It's rammed down people's throats with cheating, delusions. It's like nothing new about this. This is the 1920s all over again. I mean, my father, for example, a poor immigrant, was deluded into buying property in Florida. There was a big real estate boom. It ended up being somewhere at the Atlantic Ocean. That's not much different from the subprime mortgage scams that are going on today. But those who are responsible do it with impunity under the real laws of capitalism. We're being set up for the next and even worse crisis. The major banks, investment firms are richer than before. They're sitting on tons of cash. Corporate profits are sky high. There's a problem in the economy of limited demand. There isn't enough, people are too poor to purchase. There's no consumer demand, not much investment. There's an answer to that. The government can increase demand, stimulate it. That's how we got out of the Great Depression. That's how other countries get out of depressions. We've done it too. But that's not what the masters of mankind want. They want a focus on the deficit and the debt. One of the disadvantages of not having notes is I got off track. I was going to ask the question, why, so let me go back to that. Why, if this is disjointed, blame it on my notes up there. It was better organized than the original. But why the desperate effort to destroy Social Security and public education? It can't be because they're not working. They both work extremely well. We had a great public education system here, from the schools up to higher education, all being dismantled. So I don't know what the story is here, but in a majority of the states in the country, tuition now pays more of the cost of universities, state universities, than the state does. In California, which is, had the greatest public education system in the world, next year, for the first time, tuition is going to be more than half the funding. Tuition is going sky high. It's like private universities, and probably the main California universities, Berkeley and UCLA, probably they'll be privatized. They're almost privatized already with the scale of tuition and so on, and the rest of the system will decline. For the rich, it's fine. It doesn't affect them. Kids are going to go to private universities anyway. For the state's economy, it's going to be a serious danger. The economy relies on and has grown thanks to an educated population. That brings up another fact. I'll put it off to the side for a moment and hope to remember to come back to it, so remind me if I don't. There's, in the current stage of capitalism, the long term doesn't matter. That's a change from the past. What matters is what happens tomorrow to your what shows up in the next quarter, which also determines your salary and so on, if you're a CEO or if you're a fund manager or whatever. So the future doesn't matter, the state of the country doesn't matter, and that's what we see happening. Well, why the attack on public education from kindergarten on up? Why the attack on Social Security? It can't be because of their inefficiency. In fact, they work very well. It has to be something else. And I think if you think about it, you can see what it is. Social Security and public education are based on an extremely dangerous principle, namely that you care about other people. So, for example, I don't happen to have kids in school anymore, but if you believe in public education, I'm supposed to pay my taxes so that the kid across the street can go to school. That's called solidarity, mutual support, sympathy, and so on. Same with Social Security. Like, it really doesn't matter much to me. I get it, but it doesn't matter much. Got a big pension. But I'm supposed to... the principle of Social Security is that I care if a disabled widow across town doesn't have enough food to eat. If you believe in the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else, then it's her problem. Her husband made a bad investment or something other. Her problem, she can starve. No reason why I should give a few pennies to, which I won't notice, to make sure that she's okay. So there's a principle of care and concern for others. It's completely inconsistent with the vile maxim, and therefore it has to be destroyed. And any institution that relies on it has to be destroyed. We see that happening all over the place. It's a major cultural phenomenon of trying to destroy the most elementary human feelings. And they are elementary. To see how elementary they are, it's worthwhile going back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, say mid-19th century. Eastern Massachusetts, where the Industrial Revolution took off, there was a very free press, the freest in the history of the country. It was hundreds of newspapers written by communities, ethnic communities, workers in factories, others, expressing their views about the world and their interpretation of the world. A lot of dedication to it. A lot of the papers were in the factories. The press was run by, say, Irish artisans from Boston or young women from the farms who were called factory girls. And they make very interesting reading. They express the way people felt about the early stages of industrialization. What they felt was that their culture and their humanity was being destroyed by the process of industrialization, which was forcing them into a mold in which they're basically slaves. So workers in the mid-19th century didn't see much difference between a chattel slavery and wage labor. In fact, the only difference they saw was that one of them's temporary, so you can get out of it. That was the slogan under which Northern workers went to war in the Civil War. In fact, it was such a popular idea that it was one of the main slogans of the Republican Party. Wage labor is basically the same as slavery. They also bitterly opposed what they called, this is 1850, what they called the new spirit of the age. It gained wealth, forgetting all but self. Okay, that was the new spirit of the age in 1850, being rammed down their throats, still being rammed down people's throats, major efforts, because it's so totally inhuman that it's hard for people to accept it, but with enough beating it into your heads, maybe it'll take off. That's the hope, at least. That was the new spirit of the age then. It was the vile maxim that Adam Smith wrote about, and it's the doctrine that's being implemented right now. Right now it's called serious and courageous. When Congress gets a proposal to cut back food stamps on which 20% of the population relies, and to cut social services for the general population, but also to cut taxes for the very rich. That's serious and courageous, we're told in the newspapers. It's a basic assault on the fundamental principles of any civilized society, and it's the agenda that's being considered and in part implemented by both parties, incidentally, to varying degrees. What about the famous deficit? Suppose that we suspend disbelief and say it's really a problem. I mean, of course, it's a problem in the long term, but a very serious question whether it's an immediate problem. But let's say it is. How do you get rid of it? Well, there's some pretty straightforward ways. Just take a look at what causes the deficit. That sounds simple. About half the deficit comes from military spending. U.S. military spending is off the chart. It's about the same as the rest of the world combined. That's not for security. In fact, it harms our security, but it's for other reasons. But that's one place where you can cut away at the deficit. The other where's the other half come from? It comes from our dysfunctional healthcare system. It's the worst healthcare system in the world. It's an international scandal. It's about twice the per capita costs of comparable countries. Generally poor outcomes by standards of rich countries, even poorer ones. And there's a reason for it. It's the only system that's privatized and basically unregulated. It's so crazy that the United States is, I think, the only country in the world where the government is barred by law from negotiating drug prices. So like the Pentagon can negotiate prices for paper clips, but the government can't negotiate drug prices, with a single exception. Veterans Administration, and their drug prices are a fraction of what most people pay, and a fraction, and the same is true in other countries. So, in fact, if you take a look at the costs of the massively inefficient privatized healthcare system, what you discover is that, I'll give you the sources if you like, that if we had the same kind of system as other industrial countries, not exactly a utopian ideal, we would have no deficit. In fact, we'd have a surplus. But you can't touch that, because that goes after the insurance companies and the financial institutions. That's untouchable. They're the masters of mankind. So that's not discussed, which means that the talk of the deficit is a total farce from beginning to end, even if you accept that it's significant. But it makes sense in terms of Adam Smith's principles. All of this correlates with a lot of other phenomena that are worth thinking about. So, for example, there have been a lot of studies of the relation between Senate votes and popular opinion. It turns out that there's a correlation for the richest. For the richest part of the population, there's pretty good correlation between Senate votes and preferences. For the middle of the population, there's no correlation. For the bottom third of the population, there's a negative correlation. That is, Senate votes are the opposite of what people want. There's many studies of the relation between public policy and public preferences. There's a very sharp disconnect, both domestic and international policy. Well, that's in accord with Smith's truism. You might ask whether that's consistent with the thinking of the Founding Fathers. That's actually an interesting question. In fact, it turns out that it is. So if you read, say, the records of the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, the main framer, explains to the convention that the country has to be set up so that power will be in the hands of what he called the wealth of the nation, the more responsible set of men, those who have respect for property owners and their rights, and who understand that a major goal of policy must be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And for that reason, the system was set up the way it is. Power was primarily in the hands of the Senate. The Senate, of course, was not elected. It wasn't elected till long after. And as Madison put it, the Senate will be the wealth of the nation, and they'll carry out policies in the interests of the nation. The House, which is much responsive to the population, had very little power. The executive in those days was an executive, an administrator, not an emperor. That's changed over the years. So that was the basic structure of the country. But in Madison's defense, you have to recognize that he was pre-capitalist. He did not understand the capitalist system. For him, the senators, the wealth of the nation, were like the mythical Romans of the fantasies of the time. They were benevolent aristocrats and gentlemen who would have the interests of the country at heart. Adam Smith had a somewhat sharper eye. And Madison pretty soon saw it too. By 1792, he was already deploring the effects of the democratic experiment. And he said its power is being taken by the stock jobbers, the stock market of his day, who were the tools and tyrants of government, overwhelming it with their power, benefiting from its largesse. A pretty good description of today. But by then the system was in place. There have been battles about this over the centuries, but fundamentally it remains pretty much like this. It's also worth remembering, I don't want to go on too long, that the idea that the head of a corporation, let's say, doesn't care about the future, that's new. You go back 20 or 30 years, the CEO of, say, Ford or General Motors or General Electric did care about the future of the firm. They were trying to establish firm loyalty. They were building for the future. That's before the big shift of the early 70s. And now that's not true. With the financialization of the economy, the offshoring of production, they don't need a workforce. They can use cheap labor in the Chinese assembly plant or in Vietnam or someplace even cheaper. And if American workers collapse, well, it's their problem. Since we believe in the vile maxim, who cares? They should have become CEOs like me. If they didn't, too bad. They can get food stamps as long as they're around, but they're not going to be around for long. That changed with the financialization of the economy and the offshoring of production and the setting of working people in competition with each other throughout the world. And you go back still further, this was understood even better. It was understood, for example, by Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the founders of modern economics. And it's interesting to look back at what they said. Adam Smith understood the dangers of neoliberalism. It wasn't called that then, but pretty much the same. What he recognized, he again was concerned with England. He wrote that if in England the merchants and manufacturers, the masters of mankind in his day, if they decided to invest abroad and to purchase from abroad, they would profit, but England would decline. However, he said he doesn't think this is going to happen because the merchants and manufacturers will be influenced by what's called a home bias. They'll be concerned with the welfare of their own country, and they'd prefer to invest at home and buy at home. And therefore, he said, as if by an invisible hand, England will be saved the ravages of what we now call neoliberalism. That passage in Wealth of Nations is pretty hard to miss. It's the only occurrence of the famous phrase, invisible hand, in the whole book. That's not what you're taught in school. So the one occurrence is a critical attack on basically what's now called neoliberalism, the hope that it won't apply to England. Ricardo said exactly the same thing. He recognized that his famous principle of comparative advantage, it wouldn't work if he was, of course, also concerned with England, if English investors chose to do everything somewhere else, not mix it. But he said he hoped that they wouldn't do this. He didn't use the phrase invisible hand, but he said they'll be influenced by a home bias, and therefore England will be spared the market ravages. And he says he hopes this is a feeling that will remain, that won't disappear. Well, the instincts of the classical economists were quite good. The predictions are another matter. There's more to say about this. I don't want to go on going on too long, so I'll stop. Let me just say something else about elections, which is obviously one's coming up, so it's pretty crucial. The 2008 election was essentially bought by financial institutions. They got their rewards. The rest of the population got a blow to the solar plexus, but that's in accord with Smith's maxim. And what about the next election? Well, the next election is, I should say, you probably know this, but if you don't, I'll say it, that the masters understand exactly what's going on. So after the 2008 election, Obama won a prize from the advertising industry, public relations industry. They give an annual award for the best marketing campaign of the year. And Obama won the award in 2008. He beat out Apple Computer. And if you look at the business press, the business executives were euphoric. They said we've been marketing candidates like toothpaste ever since Reagan, and this is the best we've ever done. It's going to change the atmosphere in corporate boardrooms. It was incredible. What happens in 2012? Well, ever since the 70s, the cost of election has been rising very fast, and that has an effect. It drives the parties deep into the pockets of corporate America. That's where the money is. For the Republicans, it's like reflexive, not even a problem. The Democrats have a somewhat more diffuse constituency, not that different, but By now, the Democrats, so-called, or what used to be called moderate Republicans, if you read, say, Eisenhower, he would be somewhere way out on the left today, literally. But the Democrats are what used to be called moderate Republicans. They've disappeared, and they're following the same path. Actually, Obama is exactly the same. He's got a big concern right now, how to get reelected. The next election is predicted to cost about $2 billion. That's monstrous. And there's only one place where you can find, $1 billion. And you look at his appointments, that's exactly what they reflect. I mentioned earlier that in his economic team, they were almost all people who created the crisis. There was, in fact, one exception, Paul Volcker. Volcker was Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury, but the spectrum has shifted so far to the right that he was the leftist in the Obama administration. He was the one person who was calling for some sort of regulation, breaking up the big banks and stuff like that. Well, about a couple of months ago, he was dismissed, replaced by Jeffrey Immelt, the CEO of General Electric. Immelt's job, the job assignment for him, was to create jobs. There's something you have to understand about the English language, if I can go off into the other part of my brain. There's an unpronounceable word, an obscene word in English. I have to spell it. There might be children in the crowd. It's Profits. You're not allowed to say that. The way that word is pronounced is jobs. So when you ever hear literally, you hear a political leader saying, this is a job-killing bill, or we got to get jobs, and so on. You have to translate it. You can't say it. It's obscene. You have to translate it. So Immelt is put in there to get jobs. How's he going to get jobs? Why GE? Well, Obama pointed out, look, this is the biggest corporation in the U.S., but it happens that more than half of its workforce is abroad, and most of its profits come up from abroad, and by now it's mostly a financial corporation. It does still make light bulbs, but most of what it's done is financial manipulations. And of course, when it collapses, as it does periodically in the crises, you bail it out. So that's where we're going to get the jobs, not from Volcker, the residue of the left-wing Reagan administration, which we now have to dispense with. There's one general point about all this, which I'll finish with this. If you studied and took an economics course, you learned that there's a couple of things you learn. One thing you learn is that markets, which are a marvelous thing, are based on informed consumers making rational choices. Most of you have, say, looked at a television program, I guess, and you've seen ads. Is an ad trying to create an informed consumer who will make a rational choice? Just ask yourself. You're not supposed to notice this when you take your economics course. If we had a market system, anything like it, then an ad would be a description of the characteristics of the product. It would be like what you read in consumer reports. That's obviously not what an ad is. It's trying to delude you into making an irrational choice based on lack of information. And in fact, one of the major goals of business is to undermine markets by creating irrational consumers who will make uninformed consumers will make irrational choices. Well, when the same institutions want to destroy democracy, they do exactly the same thing. When they run elections, which are now run by the PR agencies, they want to make sure that you have uninformed voters making irrational choices. And you take a close look at electoral campaigns, and you can see that that's exactly what's happening. Same techniques are used to undermine democracy that are used to undermine markets. Now, there's another thing you learn in an economics course. There are fundamental market inefficiencies. You learn them in every first course. One of them is what's called externalities, the things that are not taken into consideration when you make a transaction. So like if, say, you sell me a car and we've got our eyes open, we make a deal that's okay for ourselves, but we don't take into consideration the effect on other people. And there's an effect, like there's more congestion, there's more pollution, other things, and that multiplies a lot considering the number of people. So that's a negative externality. We disregard it. Now, suppose you're an investment banker, say for Goldman Sachs. You make a transaction. You try to make sure that it works for Goldman Sachs. You don't take into account something that's called systemic risk. That is the likelihood that your transaction will crash the whole system. There is such a likelihood. It's constant. But it's underestimated because it's an externality. It's a footnote. Well, that's bad. That's one of the things that necessarily leads to crises. And it's understood. You can read it in major economic books. That's not the end of the world. When the system crashes, again, if it was in a capitalist economy, there'd be self-correcting because they'd go out of business. But in our kind of state, which is designed by and for the masters of mankind, the taxpayer comes in and rescues you. However, so it's not lethal necessarily, harmful, but not lethal. However, there are other cases of externalities where nobody's going to come to the rescue. And one of them is very much on the agenda right now. I'll end with that. That's destruction of the environment. If you destroy the environment, nobody's going to rescue you. And that is an externality. If you're a CEO, let's say, your task is to ensure that the environment is destroyed. That's not an exaggeration. You must act so as to maximize short-term profit and market share. If you don't, in fact, that's a legal obligation in the Anglo-American system. But furthermore, if you don't do it, you'll be kicked out and somebody else will come in who will do it. So it's kind of like an institutional fact about the system. Well, what does that mean? That means you may very well know that the acts you're carrying out will lead to destruction of the environment, but you cannot take that into consideration. If you do, you're out. Somebody else is in who does it. And that's an externality. The externality in this case is the fate of the species. But nobody is going to come in and take care of that. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. There are big, major campaigns being carried out by the Chamber of Commerce, biggest business lobby, by American Petroleum Institute and others, to convince people that global warming is a liberal hoax. And it's effective. By now, probably 2/3 of the population either denies that it's taking place or doubts it. And that's showing up in Congress. The new Congress, just about maybe close to all, maybe all of the new Republicans in the House are global warming deniers. Worse still, a lot of them are true believers, like the head of one of the House committees on the environment has informed the world that it can't be a problem, global warming, because God promised Noah that there wouldn't be another flood. Well, you shouldn't laugh. I mean, if this was happening in some tiny, remote country somewhere, okay, you could laugh. When it's happening in the richest and most powerful country in human history, you can't laugh. And furthermore, these guys are acting on those assumptions. The Environmental Protection Agency was instituted by Richard Nixon. He was the last liberal president. That wasn't I'm not kidding. And it's now being destroyed. It's being underfunded. It's being prevented from looking at greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so forth. That's a sign of the shift that's taking place, consistent with everything else that I described. It's part of the vicious cycle, and it's going very far. And if this continues, nobody's going to rescue us. It's going to be the end. Well, when we laugh at the congressman who's talking about God talking to Noah, we ought to qualify that laughter by recognizing that the current economic crisis is also the result of fanatic religious belief in the religion that markets know best. So therefore the Fed and the economics profession didn't have to notice that the economy is going totally out of whack. $8 trillion of nothing was bolstering the economy. Since we have efficient markets, I have a theorem to prove it, then who cares? Well, crashed. Fortunately, you could be rescued that time, not this time. So we really have a choice. We can either passively observe what's going on or try to do something about it. And if we passively observe, you can predict the outcome. There'll be a major destruction, and those who survive will be able to contemplate the outcome. Well, stop there.
You've been listening to a lecture by Professor Noam Chomsky, speaking at the University of Oregon in Eugene. The title for this lecture is Global Hegemony, the Facts, the Images. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Noam Chomsky is considered the father of modern linguistics. His work in the field has had far-reaching consequences, ranging across the disciplines of psychology, mathematics, philosophy, and cognitive science. His political writings, imbued with an unrelenting moral force and documented exhaustively and with the precision of the most rigorous scholarship, has had an equally revolutionary impact. He has written dozens of books, primarily focused on U.S. foreign policy in regions throughout the world, from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos to the countries of Central and South America, to Palestine and Israel, East Timor and Indonesia, to Afghanistan and Iraq and beyond. His most recent books include Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy, Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, Hopes and Prospects, and, with co-author Ilan Pappé, Gaza in Crisis, Reflections on Israel's War Against the Palestinians. To find out more about Noam Chomsky and his work, please visit the Chomsky Archive website at chomsky.info. To support humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip and in the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon, please visit the Carol Chomsky Memorial Fund website at chomskyfund.org. And now we return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Noam Chomsky spoke at the University of Oregon campus in Eugene, Oregon, on April 20th, 2011. The first member of the audience with a question referred back to the speaker's reference to the role of the public relations industry in the politics of the United States. He asked if Professor Chomsky saw any irony in the fact that today, on the University of Oregon Eugene campus, there was an annual event in the journalism school discussing ethics in journalism, and yet this very same journalism school awards many degrees in journalism to students majoring in public relations. This member of the audience asked if the speaker saw any inconsistency in the combining of journalism with public relations.
Well, business ethics is a little bit like the famous jokes about military music. It's, there's something inconsistent about it, not just public relations, but business is based on principles, not laws of nature again, but in our system, Adam Smith was right. Business leaders must pursue the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for myself and nothing for anyone else. There are qualifications. For example, in the public pressures can impose qualifications. That's what the New Deal regulations were. But if you dismantle the external effects and you just let the market reign, of course with the qualification that the taxpayer will bail you out when it crashes, we'll put that aside. If you let that happen, then you can't, the question of ethics doesn't arise. You simply have to follow those rules. If if the CEO of some corporation decides, let's say, to plan for the future, to put, suppose, let's imagine that we have, say, 3 car companies, say GM, Ford, we'll eliminate the foreign ones for simplicity. Suppose the CEO of one of them decides to plan for to put resources into planning for better cars in the future. Okay. His competitors won't. They'll put them into selling cars today, which means that he'll be out of business. So he has to act for the short-term gain. Now that's been sharply escalated in the modern phase of state capitalism, when you don't care about the future at all. You only care about the bottom line in the next quarter. Then you just have to do these things. So ethical issues just don't arise. I mean, there are some, like, don't cheat too openly or something like that. But if you just live by the rules, I mean, it's just out of the world of, it's out of the domain of ethical adjustment. Actually, I was once asked to give a talk to Journalism Association, Midwest Association of Journalists. They wanted me to talk on ethics in journalism. I told them, you don't want me to talk about this. But I told them, look, what I'm going to say is there's only one problem, tell the truth about important things. But that's not what they want. They didn't believe me, so they invited me anyway, and I told them that. And they were pretty upset because what they wanted to hear was a discussion about big problems, like, suppose a journalist comes into somebody's office and sees a letter on the table and happens to be able to read what it says. Is the journalist allowed to cite it? That's a big ethical problem. Telling the truth about what's important, that's not our business. So that's not an ethical problem. That's pretty much the same. So I don't know what goes on in the school here, but that's the basic problem, I think. And the same is true of public relations. I mean, its goal is to manipulate and control. And it's very straight and open about that. You just take a look at the major PR manuals. They're way back. Where did the public relations industry come from? It's kind of interesting to look at its origins. It developed in the freest countries in the world, in England and the United States, roughly a century ago. And it developed for a very simple reason. Enough rights had been won by popular activism so that it was getting harder to control people by force. And that was understood. The British Conservative Party understood it. The progressives here understood it. You can't control people by force anymore. You have to control them. So you have to turn to some other means. And the other means were called engineering consent. That's the slogan of the guru of the modern public relations industry, Edward Bernays, who's incidentally not a right-winger. He was a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, highly admired by Cambridge liberal elite. You have to engineer consent out of the goodness of your heart, because it's a fact, necessary fact, that only a small sector of the population, what he called the intelligent minority, everyone who writes these things is included in that. So the intelligent minority are the only people who know what's good for the country. It's Madison, The educated minority, we're the noble Roman senators. We know what's good for the country. The rabble out there don't understand. If we let them have a voice, everything will go wrong. This was the position of the progressives. Walter Lippmann, the leading public intellectual of the last century, again, a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, he called it manufacture of consent at the same time. They said the responsible men, like him, have to control policy because they have to make sure that the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders don't trouble them. As he put it, we have to be free, we responsible men have to be free of the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. That's all you folks out there. And how do we do this? Well, we used to be able to control them by force. We can't do that anymore. Have to control their attitudes and beliefs for their own good. It's always for their own good because we understand how things are done. The fact of the matter is they're just the tools of the masters of mankind, but that they can't perceive or admit. But so we have to do it for their own good, and out of that comes the public relations industry. How can you raise questions of ethics? It begins with, it's based on premises so outlandish that you just can't talk about it. It's like asking, how could the Kremlin be more ethical under Stalin? Well, I suppose maybe they shouldn't steal from each other or something, but that's not the question.
All right, next here.
Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for coming to Eugene. We're really proud to have you here. My question has to do with the structural crisis of capital and the role of agency. So to clarify that, when we're organizing our society around the principles of capitalism, can these types of structural inequalities that you point out in your talk be reformed away? Or are there innate contradictions internal to capitalism that perpetuate these inequalities, such as the drive for unlimited accumulation? If this is the case, what should we be doing to fight against this for a society that is based on human need and not on free market greed? And if you could put that in the context of Wisconsin, the Arab world, that would be fantastic.
Well, the first thing we should do is recognize reality. We don't live under capitalism. We do not have free markets. Maybe they'd be it kind of reminds me of a famous quote attributed to Gandhi, rightly or wrongly. He's supposed to have been asked once what he thought about Western civilization. And he was supposed to have said maybe it would be a good idea, But that's the same with free markets. We don't have them. The business of the powerful would never permit them. I've given a bunch of examples, but there are many more. Actually, here's an interesting case, which if I had time I would have talked about, but I'll mention it since you bring it up. Right now, there's a very interesting interaction between two countries that are quite different in development, the United States and Egypt. In Egypt, there are, and that's the answer to your question about what we should do, what they're doing in Tahrir Square. In Egypt, there's a major popular struggle going on to try to gain rights that everyone should have and that are blocked by the U.S.-backed dictatorships. At the very same moment, fortuitously, there were major demonstrations in Madison, Wisconsin, to try to protect rights that were won over a long struggle and are being lost and taken away. So the trajectories are intersecting but going in opposite directions. Egypt towards democracy, here against democracy. Well, it happens not to be the first time. The victors like to throw history into the trash can. Okay, the victims remember it, and we should follow their example. This is not the first time that Egypt and the United States were in similar situations and going in opposite directions. And the first time has a lot to say about your question. The first time was in the early 19th century. Both Egypt and the United States were sort of poised on the edge of an industrial revolution. And they were in pretty comparable situations. Both had rich agriculture. Both had a lot of cotton, which was, the oil of the early industrial revolution. There's a difference. The United States, in order to get cotton, had to exterminate the indigenous population and bring in slaves. Egypt didn't have to do that, but other than that, they both had it. They had developmental state, plans to industrialize. There was one difference, and it's the difference that makes the distinction between what we call the first and the third world, and affects us internally too. The United States had gained its independence. Egypt hadn't. The United States was therefore free to totally ignore the laws of sound economics, like free markets. They were handed down by Adam Smith. He, greatest economist of the day, he instructed the colonies that they should keep to what was later called their comparative advantage. The comparative advantage of the colonies here was produce, primary goods, fish, fur, and so on. Don't try to produce industrial goods, because England does it much better. So import advanced manufactures from England. You keep to producing, fish and fur and so on. And crucially, don't try to monopolize your resources. The main one was cotton. That's like oil today. So don't try to monopolize cotton. And he said, if you don't do that, the laws of sound economics show that it'll be harmful to everyone. Essentially neoliberal principles. That's what's rammed down the throat of poor countries today. Well, the United States has won its independence. So it was therefore able to totally disregard the laws of economics and to do exactly what England had done. England developed also by disregarding what the United States did was impose very high tariffs to block superior British manufacturers, and first in textiles, later in steel, take other measures to state intervention to create an industrial economy. It did try to monopolize cotton, came pretty close to it. Texas, this is related to the immigration crisis today. Texas and Mexico, half of Mexico along with Texas, was conquered in order primarily to gain a monopoly over cotton. The idea was, as the Jacksonian presidents put it, to bring other nations to our feet, especially Britain. Britain was the main enemy at the time because, big military power, deterrent. So we can bring Britain to our feet by monopolizing cotton. And notice what the United States came close to doing was what Saddam Hussein was accused of doing ridiculously in 1990. The tale then was he was trying to monopolize oil, bring us to his feet, a total fantasy. But it wasn't a fantasy when we did it. We did it, We monopolized, came pretty close to monopolizing cotton, industrialized by violating all the rules, and became a rich country. Well, what about Egypt? Egypt was not independent. It was under the control of Britain. And the British said they are never going to permit it. Lord Palmerston said, expressed his hate for the ignorant barbarian Muhammad Ali who was trying to industrialize Egypt. And Britain deployed its military force and its financial wealth to prevent Egypt from developing. It's kind of a microcosm of what's happened all over the world since the 18th century, and still is. The U.S. took over from Britain after the Second World War. We became the dominant power and followed exactly the same policy. Egypt was instructed that it's not going to get any aid unless it drops all barriers to U.S. imports, highly subsidized U.S. imports. At the same time, the U.S. set up high tariffs to bar Egyptian cotton. That's what drove Egypt further into disaster. And that's the way market principles work. Fine for you, but not for me. I need the nanny state. So we should stop talking about free markets. Maybe they would be a good idea, maybe they wouldn't. Maybe capitalism would be a good idea, maybe it wouldn't, but it's a fantasy. And the rich and powerful would never allow it. Well, what should we do? We should ask what goals we're trying to achieve. Do we want to achieve a society in which people's needs are satisfied? Do we want to achieve the kind of society that working people in the 19th century were calling for? Whereas they put it, those who work in the mills should own them. Nobody should be a slave of anyone else or rented to anyone else. Do we want to have a democratic system which is under popular control? Do we want to make sure that people in need get the care they need? Well, if we want to do it, we know how to do it. In fact, there's been a lot of progress in that respect over the years, and it's being done right now in front of our eyes in the Arab world. And we can do it. We have every capacity to do it. It's not a big secret.
Next. Professor Chomsky, thank you for your knowledge tonight. Some believe that the largest issues with developing or third world countries are attributed to a stark disconnect between public policy of those governments and the needs of the public. As our country's public policy continues to stray farther from the public need, how do you suggest we strengthen the voice of our public need? And if we are not heard, what do you predict will happen on an international scope?
So how do we change the system so that public policy reflects public needs? Yeah, we know how to do it. I mean, there's a lot of problems in the United States. It's a very free society. We're not faced with the kind of violent repression that Egyptians are when they demonstrate in Tahrir Square. In fact, we've reached the point where the state has very limited powers to coerce, fortunately. That's why they have to turn to things like manipulation and deceit and so on. So, okay, we can overcome that. We can figure out what's going on in the world, not too hard. It's not quantum physics. We can work with others to educate them. We can organize politically in other ways. We can carry out activities ranging from civil disobedience to electoral politics to, educational activities, to organization. And that's the way you improve the world, and it works. That's why we're a much freer society and a more civilized society than we've been in the past. And there aren't any magic keys. It's a matter of getting down to work and doing it. It's been done by our forebears. That's why we have the legacy we do. They struggled for it. We can give it away if we want, but we don't have to. And it's being done by people elsewhere. We see it right in front of our eyes, like in the Arab world today, and many other places. So there's no magic keys. It's just hard work. And it's the kind of work we can do easily, not like in the past.
Dr. Chomsky, it's always an honor to have you here, always an honor to read and hear your voice. You may remember me, Mohammed, I interviewed you exactly 5 years ago.
Could you step back a little from the mic? I think it'll be easier to hear.
Oh. I interviewed you 5 years ago, always an honor. There are three recent factors that's leading many people to predict an economic collapse this summer when the next reports by corporations come out. One is the debt ceiling. We're reaching the debt ceiling again, but this time raising it would mean America can't even afford to pay the interest on the debt. Number two, last week, the World Bank rated the American economy as unstable for the first time in the history of the dollar, and is already publishing articles about starting a new world currency. And the last factor I want to mention today is in today's global economy, where Japan is a third...
Could you please finish your question?
Yeah.
We're running out of time.
Okay, so 20 seconds?
What is the question?
The question is, do you think a global economic collapse may happen before the next election, and what would be the repercussions on America and maybe how to prevent it? Thanks.
Yeah, nobody knows. There's going to be another fiscal crisis. That's almost certain. That's why Borofsky and others pointed out what they did. The exact timing, we don't know. There could be a crisis soon. It could be delayed. There are a lot of ways of patching up the system to stretch it out. But it's not worth speculating about, frankly. What we should be doing is doing something about it. And that can be done. Like, we don't have to accept the situation in which Goldman Sachs is giving massive, I just pick them because they're just the most important, everyone else is the same, giving themselves huge compensations and for having tanked the economy, and at the same time watch Congress cut back everything that's needed for the population to survive. We don't have to agree to that. We can refuse. In that case, the economy can turn to stability. I already mentioned what we can do to deal with the deficit. It's very straightforward. Anybody really, first of all, it's a question, serious question, which you should ask yourself whether that's a priority. There are plenty of very good economists, like, say, Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, who think, and I think they're right, that it's not a priority. You can grow yourself out of a deficit. The important thing is a huge joblessness. Joblessness today is at the level of the Great Depression for most people, really. You count in the number of people who've fallen out of the workforce because they've given up, it's like the Great Depression. That's pretty serious. First of all, it's a terrible human tragedy for the people, but even from a strictly economic point of view, it means productive resources are not being used. Okay? Human beings are productive resources, and there's plenty of capital around there, and they're not being used. So I think the priority shouldn't be the deficit. But if we want to pay attention to the deficit, We know exactly how to deal with it. One thing to do is to cut back the bloated military system, but much more important is to institute a health system of a kind that is not utopian. It's the kind they have in every other industrial country. That's not pie in the sky, and that would wipe out the deficit. And the same is true on other issues. We don't have to, it's just pointless to sit around and speculate about when the next collapse is going to be. I mean, this stage is being set for it. What's important is to do something about it, and we can.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a lecture by Professor Noam Chomsky, speaking at the University of Oregon campus in Eugene, Oregon. The title of the lecture is Global Hegemony, the Facts, the Images. To find out more about Noam Chomsky and his work, please visit the Chomsky Archive website at chomsky.info. And to support humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip and in the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon, please visit the Carol Chomsky Memorial Fund website at chomskyfund.org. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at pdxjustice.org. And write to us with your questions and comments at pdxjustice@riseup.net. We'd love to hear from you. You can also view many of our more recent programs in high-definition format, streaming direct to your television via the Netflix Instant View service by selecting the Vimeo video channel. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
Left everyone else in the dust. Actually, there was an interesting review of this a couple of days ago, which maybe you saw, by Neil Barofsky, who was the special investigator for the bailout. And he points out that the legislation behind the bailout was actually a compromise. The banks who were responsible for the crisis would be bailed out by the taxpayer, of course in violation of capitalist principles, but that doesn't bother anyone. But the victims, the people who were their victims, would get some kind of compensation. Well, he pointed out, now it's a couple of years later, we can see what happens. Half the compromise was carried out. The implementation responded to the people who have a voice, the masters of mankind, and they were bailed out royally. They're now the biggest ones are richer and bigger than before, poised to set off the next crisis, which is almost inevitable. Meanwhile, the other half of the bargain was eliminated. Foreclosures continue to mount. They're going even higher. On those notes back in my hotel room, I have some of the numbers, but they're pretty telling. And that's the way democratic politics works in a society with high concentration of wealth and power. This concentration is not a law of nature. It's not due to economic principles or history or whatever. It's due to decisions, specific decisions. The country's always, of course, been unequal, but as I'm sure all of you know, it's now reached a level of inequality that's breaking all records. And that's misleading, because the actual primary cause of the inequality is in such a small sector of the population that it isn't even picked up by census figures. So you have to do more careful economic analysis to figure out what it is. It's basically the top 0.1% of the population, which has become spectacularly wealthy in recent years. That's the rest of the impact on others, including the people of England, but particularly what concerned him properly was the victims of their savage injustice elsewhere. India was his prime concern. There are modern, sophisticated versions of Smith's thesis adapted to our own society. The best one I know is by a very good, very fine political economist, Thomas Ferguson. It's what he calls his investment theory of politics. It interprets elections as occasions on which the groups of investors coalesce to invest to control the state. And as he shows over the past century, that's quite a good predictor of what policy is going to be, just looking at the coalitions of investors who became the principal architects of policy. Today it's not merchants and manufacturers, it's multinational corporations and financial institutions, but the principles remain about the same. In fact, we saw a good example of it in the last election, 2008. Obama's victory in 2008 was primarily due to a big flow of capital that poured in, especially toward the end, from financial institutions who preferred him to McCain, and that carried him over the edge. And of course, they expected to be rewarded, and they were immediately. The country was in the midst of a big financial crisis, so the main task was to deal with it. Obama picked an economic team to deal with the crisis. The team was selected almost entirely from the people who were responsible for the crisis. That excluded quite prestigious figures, Nobel laureates and others who had been very critical of what they'd done. And not particularly surprisingly, they produced a policy which rewarded those who were responsible for the crisis, often with criminal acts, I had what I thought was a pretty good talk prepared, but there's only one problem. The notes are in my hotel room, I just discovered. So I'll have to wing it, and that means I can't take responsibility for quotes and exact references, but if you want them, I can provide them from memory, as is what I'll be talking about. The world is, of course, always changing. There are, however, some quite significant continuities. It's worth paying attention to them. One is a principle that was expressed a couple of hundred years ago by a well-known figure named Adam Smith, who talked about governance and how it works. He pointed out that the people who own the society, those he called the masters of mankind, will also be the ones who set policy, and they will pursue what he called their vile maxim, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. If that sounds familiar, it is. He was, of course, particularly interested in England, and in England he said the masters of mankind are the merchants and manufacturers, and they devise policy. They're the principal architects of policy, and they ensure that their own interests are very well served, however grievous in what they're supposed to do in a state capitalist economy. Like a bank is supposed to take unused capital, like your bank account, and transmit it to some productive purpose. And pretty much that's what banks were doing. Now it's totally different. Starting in the early 70s, they moved towards more and more exotic financial manipulations, which have nothing to do with the productive economy, and in fact probably harm it, but do make plenty of money. That withdraws capital from productive purposes, but it reached such a point that right before the last crash, financial institutions literally had about 40% of corporate profits. By now, after the crash, now they're picking up again, and pretty soon it'll be the same or more. As I say, they have no known social function other than making money for people who play around with investments and short-term capital flows and so on. Meanwhile, and that set off this vicious cycle, increasing concentration of capital. The top 0.1% means CEOs, hedge fund managers, people like that. With it, concentration of political power. That concentration of political power is then used to escalate the cycle by all sorts of legislative means. For example, tax policy. Tax policy is increasingly designed to benefit the super rich and harm everyone else. That's been going on for years, has no economic purpose, but it does serve the interests of the masters of mankind. Sometimes it's done pretty subtly sometimes, so you don't notice it. So the Bush tax cuts, which are now heavily burdening the economy, were designed so that people wouldn't notice what's happening. So the first year, you may recall, the first year of the tax cuts, everybody got a small rebate, a couple $100 in the mail, so you feel good about it. And it wasn't too unbalanced the first year, somewhat, but not too much. But it was designed so that it was bad enough, but that's what's tilting the balance kind of off the scale. And as in accord with Smith's maxim, they are, the greater their economic power, the greater their political power, and they use it to accelerate the vicious cycle that has been set off. It was set off in its current form back in the early 1970s. That's the major change in world affairs since the Second World War. There was an economic system, international economic system, established by the victors in the war, the United States and Britain, John Maynard Keynes for Britain, Harry Dexter White for the United States, so-called Bretton Woods system, which laid the basis for several decades of unparalleled growth over a long period. Economists sometimes call it the golden age of state capital. They call it capitalism, state capitalism, big state component in it. No financial crises. New Deal, regulatory apparatus was still in place. The growth period was also egalitarian. The lowest quintile did about as well as the highest quintile. And that continued up until the 70s, the early 1970s. There was a significant shift. That compact, the Bretton Woods system, was based on regulation of finance, regulation of capital. So currencies were set pretty well fixed, a small band. Hence no speculation on currencies. Governments had the right to control capital flows, which they did. All of that was dismantled in the early 1970s and had a very big effect. One over the world. One in the United States, the effect was, and in fact elsewhere, a very sharp increase in in the growth of financial institutions. Back at that time, they were essentially doing